the rut is an awesome time of the year. And just real quick, how many of you guys are hunting on private land? How many are just going to hunt public or maybe a little public this year? Okay, so a few. What I'm going to talk about, there's a few things here that apply just to private land. If I mention a food plot or something, of course, but a lot of the tactics I look at, I went down to Ohio public land, hunted for 7 years. I've hunted public land in Pennsylvania for 17 years, Michigan for 30 years. So I love hunting public land, and I find that the same whitetail concepts translate from private to public land, wherever you're at. One of the things that I'm looking forward to, and what we'll talk later in more the middle of this presentation, I'm going to break this up into two halves. So and I want to have, whether it's discussion or if you guys want to go get some more beers at halftime, whatever you want to do, we'll have time to do that, and we'll have a lot of discussion at the end. And so we'll keep most of it towards then. What I really get excited about when it comes up to the rut is, and I'll talk about this later a lot in depth, but when I'm looking forward to this weekend, and I'm looking at the weather, for several days now I've been watching this approaching front, and it's kind of weird because it actually gets a little warmer on Sunday, but if you look at the morning low on Saturday, which actually when they say Friday's low is 41, which is what they're saying for around here, that's actually Saturday morning. And when they say Saturday's low is 29, that's actually Sunday morning. So Sunday morning it's going to drop 12 degrees. And when it gets to this time of year, I always look at past the 20th, that's when some bucks, especially if you have a mature buck that's on your land right now, he's probably not going to cruise from a mile away at that time, but he's going to be really active. 29 degrees, 12 degree temperature drop. It's after the 20th of October. It's going to be frozen in the morning, frosty. And I wrote an article about it on my website today. I love writing forecasts, and that's what my book is all about. All Weather Whitetails is using the weather to tell you when to hunt. Obviously, you can say there's other factors in there, but when it's 90 degrees, November 3rd, and 25-mile-an-hour winds, the bucks probably aren't going to move, not to say you can't shoot something. But we're going to talk about that later, and I'm really excited about this weekend. So I don't know if you guys have been watching that, but that's something that, I always focus on the daytime highs. So let's say you have a high of 52, and then you look next Thursday, and it's supposed to go from 52 to 37 for a daytime high, then obviously, I can't think of the math right now, but let's say it's October 24th, and it's that time of the year, and it's dropping 15, 16 degrees, then great time to be in the woods. And so I try to write about that and try to teach at least what's worked for me and give you the tools so you can look at the forecast and figure it out yourself. And a lot of times you can look 7 to 10 days in advance, which is pretty cool because the major fronts that are coming through are pretty accurate as far as their major movements, and you can see that coming in the forecast, plan around it, let your family know, your friends, your boss, that you're going to take this time off and it's going to be within a day, and you can get out there. I mean, back in the late 80s, early 90s when I was doing that, it was the marine weather forecast that I listened to on the radio on the AM station on the way to my stand. And that's about as far as I got. The Oakland Press in Lower Michigan, I'd look at the newspaper to tell me what the weather was going to be or what the temperature drops are going to be or what the temperatures were going to be. We've come a long ways. Weather Underground, AccuWeather, great tools, online tools to figure out what the weather is going to be and how that affects your hunt. The foundation of all whitetail parcels, anywhere you hunt, public land, private land, is food. And even if you have outstanding cover, if you don't have the food to go along with it for those whitetails every day, and that afternoon movement, then that cover's off or not. I've actually been on properties that are 400 acres, and that middle 200 acres, landowners haven't been into for a couple of years other than track a deer. And we go in there because it's February, and I'm looking at the land and designing it for them, and one stuck out in Lower Michigan in particular, whereas a golf course, ag field on two sides, and then a neighborhood. And so the deer had actually lots of food. They'd come in and out of that 400 acres. We went into that center 200 acres, and there's hardly any brubs, scrapes, deer sign at all. It was because those deer really didn't have to travel more than 200 or 300 yards into that parcel and bed down. They didn't really need to go any further. So that ended up some dead acres there in the middle. It wasn't food supported. Deer feed 5 times in a 24-hour period, and you might hear me say that too much tonight. But it's really important, the rhythmic pattern feeders like babies. You know, babies get it up there when they're young, or when they're just born, or every hour, 2 hours, whatever, and as they get older. But deer are rhythmic pattern feeders 5 times in a 24-hour period. And so that cycle of feeding is greatly affected when there's major weather fronts that come through. But it's also majorly affected by their afternoon food source. Imagine that they're sitting in their bedding areas and they're feeding on woody regeneration and browse, stems, briars, shrub tips, acorns. Acorns are a form of woody browse or roughage too. It's hard to digest for them. So imagine they're sitting there for 2 feedings, which would be early morning sometime, early afternoon. And then to me, they really crave having a quality food source that they can head to in the afternoon. That's the beauty of private land. We can give it to them. We can give them some greens, we can give them some beans, we can give them some corn. That's another talk altogether. We won't get into that too much, other than when you set the table and you have diversity for them, then you can expect those deer that are bedding all day, feeding on roughage, to go hit your good stuff in the afternoon. That's like our dinner time. They can't wait to get that. And the weather greatly affects that. You can imagine if they miss some feedings, then that's going to really affect their hunger pains, and we'll talk about that later, but they get hit 3 ways. They lose energy based on stress, they lose energy based on missed feedings, and they lose energy based on the temperature dropping and the cold and the amount of energy that they're going to burn while they're just sitting there. So that afternoon food source is critical. On public land, when I scout, Michigan, I think Dylan and I might go back for Michigan's opener on November 15th. And Michigan does not have the bucks that Wisconsin does in general. I have a lot of clients in southern Michigan, farmland, that do really well. So you might ask why I'd go back there to hunt Michigan, but I did hunt there I lived there for 42 years. I spent almost 30 seasons there on public land. I've gone back since and hunted, but there's something traditional about that Michigan public land sit, going out there, and we go deep back into the marshes, swamps. I can be honest, I've seen one other hunter hunting up there in 25 years to 30 years, right around there, because I go back in, wait. So there's that fun. But even then, those deer, every day, they're heading to the bait piles at all the turnoffs, parking spots, where everyone hunts. I'd say when I was up there, I knew of 2 or 3 other people that did not bait, and I lived in Munising for 14 years. And so they'd all bait, and they're not gonna wanna carry 50 pounds of bait or a bag of bait. It's supposed to be 2 gallons, but let's say 50 to 100, 200 pounds, whatever it was. They don't wanna carry that half mile back from where they park, or a quarter mile. Usually it was within 100 to 200 yards. So if you get in those core areas, that's why you don't see a lot of people. When I hunt Pennsylvania there for 17 years, they couldn't bait. So it's common to see someone when you walk an hour and 15, 20 minutes back into the hills and you go up and down, and they have 600, 700 foot changes in elevation. It's actually a little hillier than around here. People spread out a little bit more. But that afternoon food source is the bait piles. So kind of imagine I'm back in that cover. Great for me, I'm waiting for them to come back in the morning. And they're bedding there, traveling there, especially the mature bucks. And then they're heading back to that food source every night that they want to hit, and then they're hitting all the bait piles. So I've shot some nice bucks, and I'll have friends tell me that they were hitting those bait piles at 10 at night, midnight, 2 in the morning. No different on private land. What's great about that afternoon movement, and we're going to talk about the rut, I'll get to that in hunting, but I'm trying to set the table for this. You know, if I'm out on public land or I'm looking at private lands, I'm trying to set this table of movement, scout this table of movement, and then when you have this set, once you have the deer pattern, once you have the deer movement defined, then you can define your access, and then you can actually define how you hunt. So to me, you can't, I wouldn't want to go out in the woods just without figuring out any definition of movement. And that food creates that afternoon definition of movement that you can really hunt by. And it creates an assemblage of stands where it gives you morning opportunities, midday, and evening opportunities closer to food. So when you have that assemblage and that definition of movement, whether you scout for it and find it, or you create it on private land, private land's cool because you can spend a lot of money, spend a lot of hours, and you can create that definition of movement even on 40 acres or 30 acres. Public land, what's nice about that, you don't have to spend the money, but you still have to spend a lot of boot time. But you're looking for the same concepts. My first book that came out, I have an intro and conclusion of a big buck hunt, and I talk about that buck coming through and what set the table for that, and And then in the end of the book, in the conclusion, I talk about that buck and the harvest of that buck, and it was a real nice public land buck up in Michigan, out in the middle of nowhere. And I reveal that was a public land hunt. And the entire book, we're talking about hunting concepts, and I think people just assume it's for private land, but really deer to me are deer, whitetails are whitetails. I've worked in 25 states for over 700 clients across the country, and deer are deer. The habitat changes greatly, the number of hunters change greatly, but the deer do the same things. One of the things I really like about food and getting that afternoon food source, again, on private land, you're looking to get that for the entire year to take place. But to me, and what I see is basically I scout deer for a living. I'm on about 70 to 75 properties a year, and I scout them. We look where bucks are bedding, does are bedding, and there's ways you can figure that out, and where they're feeding, and if that buck's here, what is he relating to? Why is he bedding here? Why is he in this spot? Of course, I get tons of feedback from the landowner, so it's kind of cheating. I hear what they're telling me, I see their trail cameras, and we can figure out where those bucks are bedding just looking at an aerial photo, and then we can confirm that by going in there. What I see over and over again is that when you have that food source and you have a major food source, then you typically don't have a mature buck bedding right next to it. He wants to be a lot more secure in where he's actually, where he's going to live. And what I find is the older he gets, especially to 4, 5, 6 years old, he'll actually require a more remote setting as each year goes by. So I have clients that have too much food, too many does, and they'd bring those bucks up to 1, 2, 3 years old. They hold them on their property. They have a large property, and all of a sudden the neighbor's shooting them a mile away as a 5-year-old 180-inch buck. And here they hadn't even been, the neighbor hadn't even seen him till that year, or maybe once or twice a year before. He basically grew out of his home. He grew out of his space. He didn't have enough cover. He didn't have enough remote area that he could call his own. So what I see is once you have that mature, when you have that established, defined food source, afternoon food source, then those does and those doe family groups really gravitate around that when you have cover. This is, I show, and we put out about 200 videos, and so people know I live in Coon Valley. It's pretty easy to see where I hunt. This is, you can see the back of the sewage treatment plant right there, or the water ponds. And so when you're driving by on the highway, you can look up and see my food plots in Coon Valley. Those are those trails. Those deer come into those food plots every afternoon. They hold till about dark, and then they go off to the ag. There's ag on both sides, depending if they go through the industrial park or off to the side. So that's my goal, is I want those deer to hit that afternoon food source. That's feeding number 3 is what I call it. They've already fed twice during the day. They hit that third feeding, and then they go out to the ag fields at night. That's the beauty of being surrounded by ag. I do not want them on those ag fields a half hour, an hour before dark, which is that third feeding. I want them on my land and then to go out to that ag field, because then the ag fields feeds them all night. It's safe, it's social. Full moon, they're out there like crazy all night. That's where some of the bucks get hit on the road right there as they're cruising through. But it sets up that feeding where they're feeding twice during the day on browse, acorns, then once in the afternoon feeding 3 on my food plots, and then they're feeding out in the ag. And most of you have ag around your properties, I would imagine. And that's where ag is a great nighttime food source. It can be a really good setup. And it also takes pressure off. I had almost twice as much food up in the UP of Michigan and 1/3 the number of deer. But my food would only last till mid-November, early December. And it was because they were feeding 5 times a day on my food plots. I had a 2-acre brassica field disappear in 10 days after we came back from vacation. It was the same 5, 6, 7 does and fawns hitting it every single day. They just destroyed it. And because it's the only food, they were hitting it almost 24 hours. They're hitting it 5 times, all 5 feedings. So that first layer, this is going back up into some of those hollows, just filled with does and fawns. They're always there. And so if I walk through those food plots, if I walk through them to get up into the land, it shoots them off. And the guys that used to hunt there, they drive a 4-wheeler through there, and we'd benefit because I used to hunt the other land right next to it for 12 years. So they would take off and go into that land. But if we allow those to hold there, and we keep our food consistent, and we don't spook it out, then those does and fawns will do the same thing every single day. They'll bed in the same spots, and you can depend on it. If you have cover around your food, and you give those deer room so that those does can actually bed close to that. If you have open hardwoods for 200 yards, it doesn't work real well because now those does have to cross 200 yards of open timber to get to the food, and you're pushing them 200 yards back, and that's pushing mature bucks back because they don't want to bed in the mature timber either. And so if you have that compact movement, then you can expect bucks to bed behind that food, bed behind those does, and it doesn't matter what direction it is. You know, on this land and all the bedding areas for several hundred acres all around, and the Conservation Club is on the other side. I'm a life member there, I've been in those woods and all over. And you see this, doesn't matter which way that's facing. Where you have food, there's does, then bucks bedding behind. It doesn't matter if it's up or down. On the property we had before, we had CRP fields, 42 acres, and then we had 6 acres of food plots out there, and then the does would bed on the edges high, and then the bucks would bed low. If the food's down low, the bucks bed high. And so they always follow that. Then, you know, like this Sunday morning, I'm gonna be in a rut stand. I'm gonna be right behind or adjacent to those buck bedding areas up top or to the side. So I'm waiting for him to be making rubs and scrapes and really playing around in the morning hours, maybe chasing a couple does here or there, a couple small bucks. And a lot of times I don't see him get up to those tops until 2 to 4 hours after daylight. I had to sit last year where I was pretty disappointed because the first hour I didn't see any deer. And I thought, man, this is the rut, it's perfect morning, but about an hour and a half they started trickling through, and then all of a sudden I'm seeing 15, 20 does and fawns and 7, 8 bucks, and it's been one of my best sits that I've ever had. And it just took a while for them to get back up in those hills because they're playing around down towards the bottom. So when you have that set and you have that foundation and you've scouted that public or private land, then it gives you those assemblage of stands where you can hunt towards the food plots, evening stands, intermediate stands in between, and then those bedding areas up top and around the morning sits around those bedding areas up top. One of the things that I really love about bucks and hunting whitetails, I love watching bucks. I love putting a trail camera on them. That's the fun of the hunting to me, is just figuring everything out. You know, I love going on a client property and finding those, you know, looks like a buck should bed over there 75 yards away because of these things taking place and these layers. And then you go over there and sure enough, you find some rubs, some pellets, and you can tell that a buck stayed there. And that was his spot. And then you talk to the landowner and he says, yeah, we see a buck coming out of that area all the time. And that's what's fun. And then you try to figure that buck out. You know, is he a core buck, which we'll talk about in a second? Is he there all the time? Those bucks that you can actually hunt this weekend coming up? Or is he a non-core buck that you have to wait for the middle of the peak rut for him to come over from your neighbor's land and you know, get a chance at more early November? The 3rd, the 5th, the 6th, whatever it is. And so census is awesome. One of the things when you look up scientific models of census, they'll say to take a census over a corn pile August, September. And that's a really, really poor time, at least in our area. That works down in Texas or on these big giant leases in the southeast, Georgia, wherever it might be. Really poor time here because that represents a pivot point in the whitetail movement, meaning that at that point, August, September, there comes a time where your property is either going to improve as the season progresses or it's going to decline as the season progresses. So I really like to take a census in October, November. You know, right now, what bucks are on your land, does, deer herd, number of deer from now through the 20th of November, the end of November. That really tells you what population you have to influence and of course hunt and build and create and hold and protect when it comes to bucks. So a census is great at that time. We take a lot of census on mock scrapes. Not here to sell you any scents or anything because I don't use them. I literally pee on the scrape. When I start a scrape, I rake it out, clean it out. I use vines because simply from when I was 16 years old, hunting some oak knolls down in Oakland County, Michigan, by Independence Oak County Park, that's where I found a ton of scrapes. Didn't really understand them too much other than they were a scrape at that time, but they were under a lot of vines. I can remember going into an area like that, it was just full of vines and full of beds and full of deer scent, and it was pretty cool. So what I see across the country is one of the best forms of mock scrape materials, simply natural materials in the form of vines. And so pretty easy to find. I use jack pine branches up in the UP of Michigan. Jack pine seemed to be really hot up there. Just because there was not much else. And they fir, white pine, red pine, Spruce, not real good scraping material or scraping branches, but jack pines, they really hit jack pines. Using oak too works. But we use those a lot, and that's how I can tell every buck. So with those mock scrapes, we did a Primetime mock scrape census, basically doing what I'm talking about as far as we really want to take a census of the deer herd. In that system where I had those food plots that I showed earlier, we put one mock scrape. We had right around 33 to 35 bucks come in, different bucks come into that one mock scrape throughout that time. I'd say a third of those were residents. They were around the area a lot. A third of those were just in there a week or two. Maybe they come back a week later or a month later. And then we had some where just 1, 2, 3, 4 times they come through and that's it. And so that doesn't represent a huge number of bucks that are living on 40 acres. It wouldn't be realistic. But what it did tell us is every buck that came into that food plot system went to that one scrape and we got a picture of it. And all but 2 were during the daylight in that location. Hidden food plots, hidden food sources, we don't pressure them. And so we expect those deer to continue that pattern and so when you take that census, it tells you a lot. Did you just hunt the weekend before and all of a sudden your pictures go dry? Did your neighbors pull in and something changes in those pictures? So we love looking at those mock scrapes, and won't go into too much detail, but they can really help you pattern your own hunting efforts and how well you're doing. They can help you pattern what your neighbors are doing. For example, down in, are any my neighbors down in Reedstown here?
I hunt right outside of Reedstown.
Okay. Against the property I do, or? No. Okay. Scared me there for a second. I've met most of the neighbors. But anyways, we have a spot where, it's not really a secret, I talk about it online and everything else, but we have a spot where when the neighbors hunt, we see certain bucks that weekend. And so that's probably a good chance that I'll be there on Sunday, because then they might have been hunting Friday, Saturday, especially with the little cold front coming in, and that'll push some bucks over on our land that we don't normally see. And so I'll actually literally drive by their gate, see if it's open in the morning before I go hunting to make a stand decision. So those mock scrapes, having definition of movement in bucks can tell you a lot more than just cool picture of a buck and it's coming in, obviously. I really encourage you to cover your corners. This is about, I think it was just over about 90 acres of land. And really you don't need, I had a client tell me the other day that his friend had, and I want to say it was 100 cameras on 200 acres. So think of all the batteries and cards alone. But a little obsessive. But do any of you have that rate, 1 every 2 acres? I don't, and I find that 40 acres, 4 to 6, 80 acres, 7 to 9, 6, 7, 8, 10. 200 acres, that doesn't translate into 16, it might translate into 10 to 12, 13, whatever. But I found that if you cover your corners, you cover your sides, that now you know when those deer are leaving your land, because they're not just, of course, staying on your land, but especially the mature bucks, when are they coming, when are they going? It tells you a lot about those bucks, it tells you exactly when to hunt them. And by covering those corners, what I found is your coverage range stretches out to 1/4 to a half mile in every direction, so that if you have a good assemblage of cameras, you have that defined movement, whether they come in at night or during the day, you can really get a census of not only the bucks that are on your land, but all the bucks within 1/4 to a half mile. So you rarely get any bucks that really jump out and surprise you. So these core and non-core bucks. What I love about these core and non-core bucks is, and you can't put, it's not that exact in nature, and it certainly isn't with whitetails and bucks and their behavior. But what I find is that you can really lump a lot of bucks into 2 categories, and those are bucks that are living in and around your land, and they're there for long periods of time during the season, portions of the season, and then there are those bucks that live on someone else's land, and those are the bucks that will wander and come to your land. 2 different hunting strategies. The core bucks, they're there right now. So when I go out to a stand this weekend and look for a mature buck, I'm going to go to stands that I expect a buck that's been living there right now or has come in right now. We actually have a buck on the one property, Reedstown area, that comes in, really nice buck. In fact, he's the one on the picture before. But he comes in, he's come into a water hole on the 22nd, 23rd, and 24th the last 2 years in a row. And of course, last year I should have seen that and gone and sat on it. I didn't, but the 21st Sunday, is when I'm wondering if it's just too early, even those 2 days, but it's such a good cold front. He's come in where he's 10, 11 o'clock in the morning, 9 o'clock, 11 o'clock, and it's been right around 40 degrees. So you know it's a cold front day, it's cold, cool. And we look up those conditions as high barometric pressure, which is Sunday. So I think Sunday's a day I'm gonna try for that buck, only because of the past history with them. But those bucks right now, that's what you're going for early. That's what you're going for in the pre-rut. I've had about half my bucks where I've gotten just a handful of pictures of, and they're during the peak rut time, and I watch them grow up on someone else's property. In fact, I have a friend of mine, Dave, that we're watching a buck the one time all summer, and it ends up on their land. That's where it was. And he was getting pictures of it all September and October. That was his core buck. So then I put a stand out for that buck end of October in a little woodlot on a corner, just an inside corner where there's a funnel. And he knew I wanted to hunt that buck, but I really had to wait till November 6th, November 7th. I think I shot him on November 7th during a cold front, and that's where he had to come through. And Dave was pheasant hunting, bird hunting. I wanted him to go shoot that buck. And I was fortunate to get the buck. You know, between the friends that we have up there, we wanted one of us to get him. But the point is that just with a handful of pictures, a lot of times that non-core buck for 2 or 3 years, a big buck, mature buck, for 4 years, has been telling you that I'm gonna come on your land, but it's only gonna be during a decent day during the peak rut. So it really limits your time. I mean, you have a time of 7, 10 days that you can say he might be there. You throw out that hard rain, extreme winds, extreme temperatures of heat, and you throw out those bad cruising days where he doesn't wanna come over on a 30-mile-an-hour, 80-degree day on November 3rd, but on November 7th, 30-degree temperature drop, the winds have died down, barometric pressure's up, and that's when I find you shoot these bucks. And I've been doing that since the early 90s. We'll talk about it later and how that affects the rut and where you should sit. But it seems like a needle in a haystack, but I look at it like that non-core buck has told you for years in advance, I'm going to be on your land during the peak rut. I'm only gonna be there during a good weather time. That stand location's either an evening or a morning stand, depending on whether it's related to cover or food. And you go in and sit it, and he comes right to you. And it's happened several times on bucks. About half of the bucks let's say 15 bucks that are in that 4-year-old or older class, or 16 or 18, whatever, is about half have been after November 1st, and about half have been before. This buck right here is one I was just getting to know. He was a brute that I was down in Reedstown. He ended up being 214 inches. And I was finishing my third book at the time. And writing that morning, I decided to hunt in the evening for whatever reason. And he was going right by my empty stand. Neighbor found him in April, dead. We don't know how he died, couple hollows over, and he ended up being about 214 inches. But even a big old brute like that, huge buck, I mean, that's right in the middle of the day. What does that say? 11:52 a.m., 29th of October. You know, I should have had that book finished sooner. So that book will be finished before this. I'm hunting on Sunday morning. It doesn't matter. But anyways, that was that buck I was talking about. It was one we wanted. You know, it was a neighborhood buck, and you know, he gave me just 5, 6, 7 pictures over a 3-year period. You know he's going to be there. He's told you for years he's going to be there, and it shouldn't be much of a surprise when he shows up. I just throw this in here, but you know, I use some statistics here where 23 bucks in 15 years, I've shot from 20 stand locations. When I go back to 50 bucks, that boils down to those 50 bucks, when I think about them, in public land, and about 25 from public land, and then a bunch on private land. If I can think of those bucks, and I've shot them out of approximately 44 stands. So the point is that you need to have a short tree stand memory. My hunting buddy Carl, he loved to hunt the horse pasture stand. And I loved it too. I shot 2 bucks out of there. He shot 8 of his 9 bucks in 12 years out of that stand. I hunted all over the property. And I always thought, you know, I wanted to hunt the fresh stand, even if it wasn't our best stand on paper. Sometimes an average stand turns into a great stand because it's the freshest stand, the stand that's away from your neighbors and your own movements. And man, those stands become hot. All of a sudden you go out there, there's rubs and scrapes by them, and you go sit by them and they're there. It pays to have a very short tree stand memory. In those 12 years, Carl and I hunted together. It got to the point where we'd always draw straws to see where we'd sit, and I'd just say, where do you want to sit? And he'd want to go to the horse pasture stand. That gave me the choice of all the other 19, 20 stands on the property, depending on the winds, that I could go choose from and hunt. So he shot 9 bucks in 12 years. I shot 17. I used 14 different stands to shoot those bucks. He used 2 stands to shoot his 9 bucks. And I think it all boiled, because we made the same decisions. We made, as far as we're hunting east wind stands today, or southeast winds, or a morning stand, we'd talk about it and strategize. We'd help plan it together. And what it boiled down to is, I think he just loved that stand, and I didn't blame him. We saw a bunch of big bucks from there, but it boiled down into, over a long period of time, I felt that he shot fewer bucks because of that. Try to keep in mind your favorite stand should be the next stand you shoot a mature buck out of, not the last one. And then I found that the fresh stand is the best stand, and I have a lot of statistics for that too. 75% of my bucks have been shot using the stand for the first time for the year, and a lot more on the second stand, and then after the second time, and then after that. And finally, we'll talk real quick about sanctuary. Everyone talks about having a sanctuary on your land. I go to all my client properties, they say, I have this 40 acres that we've never gone into out of 80, or this 10 out of 30, or this 100 out of whatever. But then they have a road that goes through it, an access trail. Deer can see them, hear them, or smell them. If deer can see you, hear you, or smell you, it's not a sanctuary. And your food plot should be just as much your sanctuary as your bedding areas, your most remote bedding areas. Your food sources are so critical. Again, if you don't have that daylight, everyday movement all season long, to where they come into those food plots an hour and a half before, or an oak flat on a public land area that's going to sustain deer movement for 3 to 4 weeks. We have greenbrier that we hunted down in southern Ohio on public land, and they love that fresh greenbrier. So they hit those tops where there's a lot of sun hitting it, and so it'd be fresher, and so you could tell it just mowed down. They hit that every day, and if you allowed that to repeat over and over, that could be a season-long movement in a location like that, where acorns are there for a few weeks. But if you allow those conditions to take place, if you allow those food plots to be considered sanctuary just as much as your bedding areas, if you allow that core area to take place, there's very few areas around here where you have 20, 30 acres that include food plots, good timber management, bedding areas, movement from those bedding areas to food, water holes, mock scrapes, whatever it might be, that the deer have the illusion that they're not being hunted in, that they don't ever hear you, see you, or smell you. That becomes a true sanctuary when that takes place, and that's where the true power of having private land and being able to control that, even if you only have 30 acres or 40 acres, is a lot more powerful than most people think. Most of my clients that I go to, they have no idea how good it can actually be when they allow a high percentage of land to become sanctuary. And what I mean by a high percentage, 40 acres, it's really hard to have 40 acres be devoted to all deer all the time, because you have to access your land. So I find on most 40 acre parcels, it's, the best you can get into is at 20, 25 acres. Into that 50, if you get 50% of your land, a core area that you don't let your scent, your sound, your sight get into, then that's a pretty good percentage on 40 acres. When you get to 80 acres, you can bump that percentage up a little bit, 60, 65%, because the amount you need to access by is still the same on 40 or 160, doesn't really matter. So when you get up to those 160, 200, 400 acre parcels, you can start to divide the land, have this piece over here, this piece over here. They complement each other, they move between each other, they have the same food, and the deer will move back and forth, but you can get a higher percentage of your land devoted to all deer all the time. I call that the efficiency of your parcel, the efficiency of your land. Pretty cool, because I see a lot of public land areas that have more core sanctuary on it than a lot of private. When this one's peaking, they're all going over here. When this one's peaking, they're going here. When this one's peaking, they're going over there. That's causing all these does and doe family groups to fight and be very aggressive towards each other and fight for that territory. I'd rather have the same thing planted in all the food plots, but a diversity. I split my food plots in half. On bigger parcels, we'll split them into thirds, so that you have all those plantings in the same food plot, and they're scattered across your entire property all the same. That way there's no more reason for deer to be over here or over here or over here. The does and fawns that relate to this food source can stay here and stay consistent all season long. Same with this one and this one. They don't have to fight. When that happens, I feel that mature bucks relate to those individual movements on your land, so you can actually push the number of mature bucks up substantially and significantly that relate to your private parcel, even a 40 acre parcel, on a daily basis, because they're spreading their movements. These does are consistent, and then you have mature bucks that relate to each one of those all at the same time. When it's all mixed up, then you have does and fawns fighting with each other, and I believe that mature bucks, it pushes them out even further because there's a lot of chaos and stress. Might be on your neighbor's land, and then you have a lot fewer mature bucks that relate to that movement because it's a big chaotic mess. They're just more likely to go somewhere else, especially when they get into 4, 5, 6 years old. So keeping the stress level, whether it's providing a sanctuary, whether it's taking your food sources and making sure they're diverse in all places, keeping that stress level low pays off in huge ways for you in setting the table and making sure that deer will stay on your land all season. Scent control, you know, obviously walking these hills around here, Dylan's partner Mike, we went up hunting on Sunday morning to a spot, and a lot of my stand locations up top are a half-hour walk in, and I'm sure you guys have a lot of those treks too. When the neighbors used to use ATVs on our land, then we'd get all the deer coming over by us. We had up to 20 or 30 deer come over to us in the morning when they'd buzz their ATV up through 30 acres of cover, clear out every deer in the entire parcel, and then we'd see that over there. I've seen that pattern since the 80s when it used to be the neighbor using a Big Red ATC. I think 250 cc was the biggest they'd get, maybe 200. But that was 3/4 mile down the river bottom. I'd hear him driving from his farmhouse in off the dirt road, and then at daybreak or around daybreak, I'd have all the deer clearing out that entire area coming to me. It's hard around here to keep your scent down, to keep from getting sweaty. The cool thing is we have hills. So when you're up high in the morning, you're above the deer, you pretty much will not get detected except for your scent walking in. You know, if I always have clean clothes, clean boots, we spray down. So we try to leave no trail in the woods left behind, and that's going to our stands or coming from our stands. But when you're in your stand, to me, the best form of scent control that you can ever have is stand location. So if you're on the downwind edge of the deer that you're watching, if you have defined movements, if you're hunting the hills around here, high in the morning, lower in the evenings, on the sides in the evenings, then you can really take your scent completely out of the picture. And that's how I like to place my stands. That's how I like to work it. So I look at it like if deer's downwind me, and sure it happens, but a lot of times, especially those morning hunts, it shouldn't ever happen because the scent's lifting off and they're not going to get me. In the evening, a lot of times I'm hunting on a point. So I'm out on this point right here, the wind's coming in from the side. Let's say it's a straight west wind. It keeps coming in like this, blowing off. The deer are moving above me. So I have locations where I'll sit in a stand, the deer are above me in the afternoon because my wind's coming from there, blowing off the point, going that way. And then the closer it gets to dark, it just falls behind me into a non-deer area as the deer are going back and forth in front of me. And in front of me, we have a water hole, we have a mox grate, maybe it's a bench on public land, connecting a cutting over there and a cutting over there, and I'm just watching that barbell of movement, blowing my scent into a safe area behind me. But you can really take your scent out of the picture with proper stand placement. And in that case, the one I'm just describing, we actually have the bench for watching. I have a stand above that area, and that scent can blow into a rocky area up a snowmobile trail where we don't have a lot of deer. So we can use that stand morning, evening, those 2 stand sets for that movement. And we get a lot of use out of that area. And I feel like we can keep our scent out of there no matter how much we smell or how much we stink. So scent control, huge part of it, but again, getting back to the basics, a lot of times it has a lot more to do with your stand location than actually spraying something on you that you can expect or using a machine or whatever it is to completely eliminate your scent. In 2015, in Outdoor Life issue, November issue, I published this cold weather hunting formula in the rut issue. And this is a formula that I've been looking at the weather and the conditions since the early 90s, and this was just a way to express that. There's a lot of calculations in it. I'll show you right here. There's a lot you can put into it. It's an algorithm, with different priorities of wind or temperature change. But bottom line is, I try to make these up. I came up with a little thing today on my site. I put it on Facebook. We make videos about this stuff different ways. I use Weather Underground, which is a great weather source. Weather Underground gives you this really pretty chart that shows the temperature line, and it shows you the barometric pressure line, and where they meet a lot of times is when bucks are really, really active. I put these out because I just, I'm not selling these maps. I don't have a weather table to sell you or anything like that. I do have an all-weather book. But these, I'm trying to put these out because I feel like they help hunters. And I'm trying to, instead of just saying, here's a day to go hunting, because it's going to be a good day, I want to tell you, this is a great day, this is a high value day, and this is why. And this is based on decades of use. So on here you can see the green dots, whether it's dropping 9 degrees in the temperature or whether the morning low is going from, if you can see, I think it's on the 5th of November right up there, it was 63 was the low. That meant on the 6th, it was 63 degrees in the morning. The next morning it was 39 degrees. The temperature during the day only changed, what was that, 5 degrees during that time. But that's a huge change in the morning. That usually means the air is cleaning out, the barometric pressure is going up, the low pressure is cleaning out. Great time to hunt. And that's what's happening this Sunday. It's been forecasting between 9 and 14 degree temperature changes every day because I've been watching it like a hawk for the last 3 or 4 days. You can see these fronts coming 8 to 10 days out, sometimes 14 days out. The bigger they are, the further out they project. And then you just have to watch, when they're getting closer in that long range forecast, it might be a 16 degree drop instead of an 8. It might be a 20 degree drop instead of a 24. The wind speeds might be 35 mile an hour, 40 mile an hour instead of 15. The precipitation, there might be precipitation, there might not be precipitation. That's actually the worst, that's the hardest one. Wind speeds or wind directions usually pretty safe because those major fronts involve the major jet streams that go through the country. So those major weather patterns are hard to change. They're solid in there. So the wind direction, temperature, something's going to happen. You can see it a long ways in advance. So I like to look at this stuff, and I just put it out there just to help people. I sometimes pick different cities where I grab that information from. I'll pick a random, just look on the map, pick a random town in Indiana or Michigan. Those fronts sweep through. So I was talking to a guy from Pennsylvania online this morning, just answering a question on Facebook. And he said, Sunday's not looking good for me, but I pulled up his area. Monday was awesome. Monday. So what's happening Sunday morning here, it's happening Monday night over in Pennsylvania. Just, similar weather all the way through. Well, you can just look at the weather. If there's major temperature drops, wind speed. It's not that it has to be calm, but imagine if the wind drops from 55 mile an hour or straight line winds. I was up in Canada finishing this book for 10, 11 days, got back last Friday. I was holed up in a cabin with no Wi-Fi, texting, cell, or anything. And so it got me away to be able to write and not worry too much about anything else. We had over 50 mile an hour straight line winds the one night, knocked out the power for 44 hours, and almost 2 days. And, imagine the deer, imagine the moose are up there because it was moose season. They're holding tight in that 55 mile an hour wind, in hours of that wind and trees crashing down. They're highly stressed. Imagine as it relates to their feeding. So those deer, imagine they're back on a knoll somewhere, getting pounded by those winds. Everything's crashing down. They're not going out into the open ag fields at night to feed and gorge themselves and sit and be safe and social all night long. They're getting hammered all night long. They can't wait to eat. They miss feedings. The temperature drops. In that case, there was snow on the backside. So the temperature drops 20, 30, 40 degrees all of a sudden. The Edmund Fitzgerald went down on November 12th, I think, or 13th, somewhere around there. 29, sailors lost their lives. I've been up on Lake Superior in those winds. It's just hellacious. 15, 20-foot waves coming in. There's people surfing up by Marquette. I think someone died this year surfing up by Marquette. In that. Big enough waves to surf up in Michigan on Lake Superior. Crazy winds. But imagine those deer. They're getting bombarded by stress, anxiety, loss of feeding, quality feeding opportunities, and then the temperature's dropping, so they're getting cold and chilled. So they're getting a triple whammy of energy loss and energy depletion. As soon as that breaks, let's say those winds were 50, it dropped to 25, what a great time to go in the woods. Let's say it dropped from 25 to 15, doesn't really matter. Let's say the temperature dropped 20 degrees, it dropped 18 degrees, 12, 10, 9 around in there. 30, doesn't really matter. It's usually the bigger the drop, the more extreme the weather coming through and the hungrier the deer. It's no different than if you or I were lost out in the wilderness, we're out there for 5 days. First thing you want to do when you get rescued is eat a bunch of food. We survived, we're hungry. But do you eat that same amount of food the next night? Probably not. You usually don't eat that amount of food the third day either. You might eat a little bit more the second night because you were deprived for 3 or 4 days and you were starving, literally. You might eat. That's how I look at deer. When they get through that front, they're hungry. they go hit that food really hard that morning, that evening. There's a really high value for that day right after, maybe a portion of that second day. And of course, if it's during the rut and the temperature's staying low and pretty good cruising conditions, you get a lot higher value just because it's a rut. You get that factor filled in. That weather can play a huge role in determining when you hunt and your entire success rate based on that formula. Here's the overall formula. You can go through it. Basically, I came up with a formula, and I have this on my site. I had it on my rut video last year. If you just look up, Sturgis formula or a rut formula or something like that, you'll find it. I put this in October Life. Or Outdoor Life. They have that out, published on their site. But the bottom line is, what I wanted to do is express what I thought were those great days that I've been watching since the early 90s in a formula that you could plug in the numbers if you wanted to, and it comes to a number of 70. And you divide that, what your score is, and it'll give you a ranking of that day 1 through 10. You'll find in a 45-day forecast from October 1st to November 15th, there's not a lot of days that are in that 7 to 10 category. There's usually 8, 9, or 10 out of 45 days. There's a lot of days that are bad, that come up into a 1, 2, 3, 4. That's the majority of them. And then you have a few in between. Because with the extremity of weather, the way it works is you have the extreme weather patterns come through. It throws everything through the roof. You have a lot of bad days, and there's not a lot of days in between. And there's not a lot of days in between because those are those calm, boring days. Now, when you get into the rut, those days can be hot days, especially when you're watching morning to morning. Like, for example, this Saturday to Sunday, the temperature is going up, but the morning lows are going down significantly. And that's something you can watch for. So you can look at that formula, and it's boring, and you can figure it out if you want to look at the numbers and figure it out and express it in a ranking from 1 to 10 for that value day. But of course, we're not going to do that here. You have, whether you're on public land, you've identified your food sources, your bedding area, and your movements, and you define where those bedding area stands are, those evening food source stands, maybe the areas in between. And you get that all set, your scent control, you're monitoring your bucks, you're figuring which ones are core bucks, non-core bucks, when you can hunt them. And for example, like on those non-core bucks, when I love looking at those bucks, John Azoga is a deer research biologist out of Michigan. He's the most peer-reviewed, quoted deer research biologist in the country that there's ever been. He's got over 100 peer-reviewed articles, and he's a true scientist. He lived in Munising, he still lives in Munising, his wife and family. I've sat in their kitchen table, talked to him about other things. He actually collects bottles, a lot of the old logging camp bottles and their stamps they look for. That's his side stuff, but he loves whitetails. And he tells me stories about the mature bucks they followed, radio collared, the ones that they had in the Camp Cousino Mile enclosure. They had some incredible bucks. He had some of his favorite bucks. They had personalities. He tells me that, does and doe family groups kind of do the same thing every day. They're herd mentality, but bucks, shy bucks, aggressive bucks. He told a story about one of the bucks that he had in the Cousino enclosure, and I'll get the number wrong, but it was like M114. And this buck they'd rank him on hierarchy and on what bucks they'd display dominance to and which ones would dominate them. So I don't know how many bucks are in there, let's say 20, 30, but this buck was about 10, 12. He's a 4 or 5-year-old. The buck that was the primary dominant buck was a fighter, ruled the enclosure for a couple years. He killed bucks, and he was eventually killed. And they fought aggressively hard. Immediately, this buck that was 10, 11, 12 in the pecking order moved up to number 1. He ruled that enclosure for 7 or 8 years. No buck deaths due to fighting that entire 7, 8 years. He bluffed, postured, faked, never got in a fight, and that set the tone for the whole herd. But that's that personality of a buck. And I'm not saying those does and doe family groups, those fawns, don't have personality. But when those bucks, that's what's cool. I love figuring out, is that a core buck? Is it a shy buck? Is it a non-core buck? If it's a non-core buck and you don't expect them into the peak rut, I wouldn't sit in that stand this weekend or probably the next weekend, because I don't want to burn out that area. I don't want to burn out those does, those fawns that might be there, the other small bucks. Now all of a sudden that buck comes in when he's supposed to, and there's no sign, there's no scent, there's no urine count or urine scent, there's no pellet count, there's no rubs, scrapes. He doesn't really feel welcome when he comes into that area because you've overhunted that location. So I believe that, knowing which bucks are on your land and when and why you hunt them, where they're coming from, covering your corners, Really important to figure all that out, and that's what's fun to me about the hunting, all that figuring out. High value, we discussed the weather and determining those values. There's a few reasons you do it. I get online a lot and guys will say, it's a really stupid process because, no one can take that amount of time off. I have to work, every day. And I will admit, I can hunt almost any day I want. But at the same time, when I did have an employer and I worked in banking, I was an appraiser for 10 years, had my own business, and I was in banking for 9 years, and then I've done this. That's the 3 things I've done in my life, for work-wise. And I liked banking, and of course appraisals is my own business, but I like banking because a lot of women work there, and I could actually choose my hunting time because, there's not a high percentage of them hunted. I don't even know if any of them hunted at that time down in lower Michigan. So I liked that banking because I found that I could take a morning off, an afternoon off, I could take a half day, a full day. I could really play that. And that was back in the early 90s. I was in banking from 1990 to 1998. So, that worked really well with that schedule. And I actually chose that banking schedule because a buddy of mine that hunts, a close friend of mine, Mike, he hunts, fishes all the time, and he was already in that bank, so he got me in the door. And he said, this is a great place to work if you want to hunt. You want to fish all the time. So I said, hey, sounds like a good place for me. I don't know anything about banking, but it was a good place to work. I enjoyed working there for 8 years, not just because of the hunting, but the whole point was that determining those high value sit days helps you really arrange your schedule with your family and your boss, your friends, your social time. So in that book, I talk about, how the weather can really help you balance between hunting and the other priorities of life. Whether you put career before your spouse or vice versa, that's on you, but you can still, you look at it, how can I determine that I want to go hunt that tree stand? Do you burn it out 3 days in a row hunting it, or do you have a great day that's coming 2 days later that instead of taking a Friday off because you can't wait to hunt, you work it out with your boss that you can take that Monday off. And you hunt that Monday instead of burning it out on Friday, Saturday, Sunday before. Maybe because you see that big cold front coming on Monday, you actually spend time with the family on Friday, Saturday, Sunday, do whatever. And I'm not here to judge anybody, whatever they do, but there were times when I was even a real estate appraiser and I could kind of come and go when I wanted. I had the local banks I worked for, so they were always on me for getting the appraisals done. I really had to be, I had a hard time leaving for a week. I had a hard time leaving for 5 days. So there were times where I would literally drive 7 hours from Michigan down here to Southwest Wisconsin because I moved here in 2012. I would make that 7-hour trek to hunt one Wednesday evening, one Thursday morning, and then go back because that's when the cold front was. And my buddy Joe would get upset with me because he worked his normal, he actually had a banking job. He wanted to take his long day weekend off, and I'm looking at like it's going to be 75 and it's the end of October. I don't want to go. I want to go on this Wednesday, Thursday. So it involved, a lot of times I'm hunting like a Thursday morning. Wife and kids are going to bed, and it'd be 9 o'clock. I'd actually leave, drive all night, sleep in the truck an hour or two, and I'd get up and hunt that cold front. I slept for 45 minutes. I'd go out in the woods, and then I'd go hunt, and then I might hunt a day and a half, and I'd go home. So I'm trying to fit in these high-value days and manage a business and manage a family. 2 years ago, I went down to Ohio, in southern Ohio, and it was after it was gun season opening day. My stepson Dante, Diane's boy, took him out. He shot his first buck. It was awesome. Gun season, did all that, tracked it, got a hold of it, got taken care of. Somewhere 3, 4, 5 in the afternoon, I headed to Ohio on a 10-hour trip. Got into the area like 3 in the morning, slept in the truck. It was a 25-degree temperature drop. How could you resist that? Had 40-mile-an-hour winds. They were down to 20. Shot the buck at 8 o'clock in the morning, 9 o'clock. Maybe I could have shot him the day before, the weekend before, the day after that, but that was the perfect day. And I put a lot of effort into going to that one day, and that's proven time and time again since the early 90s, over and over again. So that high value sit there. In fact, that day, our opening day, Monday, I was home by Thanksgiving. I was able to actually have a really high value hunt and figure that out. You could see that coming, especially that big cold front like that. You could see that coming 10 days out, 14 days. If all of a sudden, you you notice and you start, people are talking, there's gonna be a great front coming through, a great time to hunt 3 days from now. You couldn't have been watching the weather, because it's probably that front was in the weather for 10 days out, especially if it's a really good one. So the high value sit, it really helps you make hunting decisions that gear you towards success. It's not that you have to hit every high value. When I was in Pennsylvania for 17 years hunting public land, there were up to 18 guys in deer camp and a couple women at times. And everyone was hardcore hunters. They go out on public land, they're out for the whole day, and they come back. And it was fun. There's only like 15 acres with the camp, and so everyone drove 5 miles. I would say 10 years ago, they shot their 200th buck in camp. Everyone's marked on a pin, and all this terrain, it's 600, 700 foot changes in elevation. So they all have red dots where every buck is shot, yellow dots for does, and then there were black dots for bear that they shot. Really cool hunt, cool camp. They played poker. I don't play poker. I've tried to play poker there. We're playing dime poker, nickels, dime, quarters if it was a big game. I'm sure I lost 50 bucks, throughout the years playing dime poker. That's how bad I am. You have to know when to play, when not to. Same with playing poker in the deer woods. I have a chapter in my book about playing poker in the deer woods. And it comes down to you're making decisions based on percentage of success. That's what the formula does for me. You're just making educated decisions. You're trying to do your best. You know that if it was just pounding rain for 5 hours till 4 in the morning, and there's going to be continued rain, but it's not going to be till 2, 3 in the afternoon, that might be a really good morning sit, even if the temperature didn't change, the barometric pressure didn't change, and the winds didn't change. You have 7 hours of open air where it's not pounding rain, and the deer can actually get up and move. They can feel that rain's coming, so they know they got to eat right then. So you're looking for that hole in the weather. You're looking for that. Same with snow. You have snow coming through. You have those heavy northeast, east, southeast winds. It's bringing wet snow coming in, big blizzard coming in. I can remember it was in December in 2010. I was after a big 6-year-old 8-point. I've written about this before, where I missed him at 75 yards with the muzzleloader. I'd had a bad year that year. I had a lot of mishaps. More mishaps that year than a lot of years combined, but that was one of them, and it still haunts me. He's just pushing 170 as an 8-point giant. He's like this, 24, 25 inches inside spread, just a big giant buck. That was the night before. Huge snowstorm coming in. It dumped about 7, 8, 9, 10 inches. Wet snow. Somewhere in there, it turned around. Northwest breezes blew it out. And there's a hole in there. It happened to be in the afternoon the next day. I went into the stand, and sure enough, he comes out hour before. That's the buck I'm after, and I miss him. And then he went down about 125 yards away, let me reload the muzzleloader. I couldn't get the 209 primer out, so I ripped 3 fingernails back, had blood on the snow below the stand on the muzzleloader. Never did get a second shot at him. But watching for those holes in the weather, I happened to see 40-some deer that night. It's the most deer I've ever seen here in one sit. I think it was 43 deer. He was the 44th one. They were all moving from an exposed west-facing, northwest-facing draw, and they're going through the saddle and just going down into the southeast-facing draw. And they're going down there to be sheltered, and he was one of them. He was feeding on the way. He's one of the last ones to move through. Just a hole in the weather, and watching for that. Of course, it did drop in temperature a lot. You're playing poker in the deer woods. It doesn't mean you always have the perfect hand. There's no guarantee, but at the same time, you're making decisions based on family, career, friends, time off, and just slanting towards the success. A lot of times you can do that if someone will say, when would be the best weekend to take off? Or when would be the best week to take off? Well, if you have to play it that way, I'd take, not this weekend coming up, but the 26th, 27th, and I'd take the next 2 weekends off, and I'd ask my boss, can I please just let you know if I can take a Friday or Monday off that week? I'll just look at the weather, and if you just slant that much, just that, then you could be a lot more successful than forcing it on a day. My lease partner, Carl, that I hunted with for many years, close friend of mine, he would come up from Georgia. He used to live in Michigan. We've hunted in Kentucky, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin together, and I think that's it. If I didn't say Pennsylvania, we hunted Pennsylvania together. But anyways, he'd drive up 21 hours, and he had to do that with his time. He worked for Chaparral Boats, and he had his time off, and that was the time he had to take hunting. So 9 days. He'd get up on a Friday night, Saturday, Sunday, all the way through the following Sunday, drive all night to get back to work. And we figured during that time he'd have 3-4 really good days to hunt, 3-4 really bad days to hunt, and 3 or 4 that were in the middle. Those bad days throughout the years, instead of pounding that horse pasture stand over and over again that he liked to do, he'd just go to the stockyard bar and drink and play pool. And he looked at it like it was a vacation. But that let those stands heat up. Let those stands, he wasn't pounding those stands on bad days. For that, he shot a lot more bucks during the end of when he was coming up than in the beginning, because I think he managed those 9 days better. And something that you can use with those high value, use it to manage your career, home life, whatever you want to do, but you can slant, you can play poker in the deer woods and have a better chance. Now get into this pre-rut. The pre-rut's my personal favorite time to hunt. Of course, it's the first part of the rut and it's exciting, you want to get out in the woods, but at the same time, if you have core target bucks in your area, it's the best time to shoot them. They're going to stick close. There's no reason on Sunday for a buck to come over from a mile away. He's already got does over there. He doesn't need it. When those does start coming into heat the end of October, early November, there's a pile of them. Every buck gets to play. Every buck has a doe. They all get to play in the game. The studies have shown that they breed 2 to 4 does a year, 3 to 4 does right around there. They might breed another one during the secondary rut, but not very many do. So they're taking 2 or 3 days with this doe, and they're hanging around her, pushing her, holding her, protecting and fighting, and then it takes another day or 2 to find another one. It's exhausting. That's why they lose so much weight. And so the pre-rut is fun because if you have a buck in your area, he's going to stick in your area. The patterns you've been watching all October are on scrapes with your trail cameras with sign. He's there and he can hunt him. So I love hunting the pre-rut. At the same time, it's not like the peak rut. This Sunday, I'll probably sit for 4 hours, 5 hours right around there, till lunchtime maybe. And then I might go sit somewhere in the evening maybe, but my priority in the pre-rut is the morning hours. They really move during those cold temperatures. And I think it's supposed to be, let's say 55 on Sunday, I believe, 29 in the morning. So that means by noon, it's probably still in the 40s. Pretty good, comfortable cruising weather. 2, 3 in the afternoon, 4 o'clock, it's starting to hit 55. And so when you go out to the stand, the temperature is going to change that last hour. And that's only when those, just a side note, that's only when those thermals are going down. So if you're counting on those thermals for a whole 3-hour sit to go down, they're only going to go down with the temperature. They're only going to go up with the temperature. And that's why those thermals, they'll move up all morning long because the temperature's changing all the way till 2, 3 in the afternoon. So great time to hunt, comfortable cruising weather, and you're just getting in next to a buck bedding area where he's at, and instead of him just sitting up and moving around a little room like this, he might cover 5 acres. And if he sees a smaller buck coming by, he might go chase him. He might go after him. He might go chase some does. They're not ready, but he's going to stick to that little core area. And instead of moving just a few hundred feet, he's going to move 100 yards, 200 yards. And if you're in close to him on a cruising bench, and if that bench happens to connect to a doe bedding area, even better. I love those morning hunts, especially when we can get up high, let the thermals go up. Maybe you're on a point. Maybe you're in an area where there's a rock face. You can let your scent blow into the rock face and go up. And then he's down below you on the bench in the morning, but it's going to go up. So high priority during the pre-rut in the morning hours. Not to say I don't hunt in the evening, but I'm not going to sit in a line of movement. They're going to food in the evening and potentially destroy a really high value hunt in the morning the next day. So it's all about playing those values even during the day. Just kind of planning ahead, saying, you know what, I can hunt that movement over there in the evening because it doesn't relate to this really high quality morning stand. I can't wait to hunt over here. And you're potentially bugging out that movement by going in there and sitting over food or near food, and it spooks out the movement for that buck up there. So just making those decisions. But I really love hunting the morning as it's coming up. Great time to shoot some target bucks. And I really want to shoot that buck that's been there on the 22nd, 23rd, 24th down on that one property. He's an 8-point, but he's huge. Just one of those big, heavy, massive 8 points, 160, 170, whatever he is. I would say he's either 6 or 7 this year, right around there. I mean, he's just a big old buck, but he's one that I'm hoping's around, and I haven't checked the cameras for a few weeks down there, and not really sure. The peak rut's the wild card of the rut. The pre-rut's a time where you can shoot a specific buck. The peak rut's a time where you still have a 50-50 chance at that buck, but you have half a chance that he's a mile away on someone else's property. Like that core buck when Dave came over to the land, I shot him on November 7th. We didn't have any pictures of him up until that time. The years before he had shown that he went through that funnel and he'd be right around that time, within days of that time. But that's a time where you don't know what buck's coming by. Great time to hunt, of course. And instead of having that high value in the morning and a low to mid value in the evening, you can have that high value all day. You don't know when a buck's going to come off that time. You don't know when he's going to go to that doe, when he's going to come off a doe, when he's going back and forth. So I love the peak rut time. I love hunting between bedding areas in the morning, cruising areas midday, and I really like getting into a funnel on the way to food. You know, in my case, I'm usually hunting, like in the one property, I'm hunting 100 yards away from food or 150 yards away. On the other property, it might be 50 to 75, depending where I'm sitting on that evening stand. But I really love to relate to food. So a lot of times it relates to multiple tree stands. You know, I sit out in the woods all day a lot, but I rarely sit in the same stand. I do have a few all-day stands. I could say out of the 21 stands I have on the 3 properties and 5 or 6 blinds, a couple of them used for bow, I have a good 4 or 5, 6 that I could consider all-day stands. But an all-day stand to me has to relate to bedding during the morning, food in the evening, food source movement in the evening, and daytime cruising. So it's got to have all those 3 variables, because I'll look at it like I want to rank these stands. I'm just in my head, you know, kind of a numbers guy, but if you look at this stand is, this sit is a potential 10 out of 10. You know, Sunday morning's a potential 10 out of 10. And let's say Sunday morning's in the peak rut. I'm going to sit in that 10 out of 10 stand. Is that holding for midday value? Is this a spot I can expect bucks to cruise on between bedding areas? Or is this just a morning spot where it's a transition spot, he's going back to bedding, and then I'm too exposed, maybe in open hardwoods, and I need to move somewhere thicker? But I'm looking at, like, this is a 10 out of 10 in the morning, but is that a 10 out of 10 in the evening? And if it's related to bedding area and all those deer are going to food, and I'm on the back side of that bedding area, it could have been an outstanding stand in the morning, but it's a terrible stand in the evening. So I'm looking at, even if I just look at morning, evening, I'm looking at a total score of 20. I'm getting 10 in the morning and 2 in the evening. It's a 12 out of 20, not that great during the rut. On the flip side, if I go find a 10 out of 10 stand in the evening, and this one's a 10 out of 10 in the morning, I'm getting 20 out of 20 or whatever that number is, just high value. You're looking at high, and then maybe midday I'm considering. Is this a spot where it's next to cover, it's in a funnel, it's between bedding areas? Is this a spot I expect to shoot a mature buck during the middle of the day? And if not, I'm going to go to that evening stand earlier, and if it is, I'm going to stay in that morning stand longer. I have used 3 stands before. Morning stand where deer are transitioning through a funnel. Actually, the funnel that I shot that buck that I was talking about, where it came in the evening. And then I go to across the fields where I know those deer have cleared out of the CRP and out of the food plots, and I go and out of the ag field, go directly to a stand. Now I know the coast was clear. If I went through there in the morning hours, I would have buggered it out. Deer would have been out there, I would have spooked them. So I wait for them to all go to bed, all get into their, does and fawns get into their beds, go straight to a stand, and I expect that cruising buck to be paralleling the field edge for the middle of the day. And even I've done that over a water hole, had 8, 10 bucks coming in up till 2 o'clock. My scent's blowing out into the field, so then I have to get out of that stand for the last 3 hours, go somewhere else. But really looking at the high value stands, a lot of times peak rut is the key. You know, you have to use those multiple stands. Great time for non-core bucks. You know, that's when you get to. I'll mention, I didn't put in here the rut lockdown phase. I think there's a lot of truth to that, and it's just when the bulk of the does are coming into heat. I think that's early November around here. I've seen times where it really slows down in cameras. The scrapes are slowed down, and there's just a 3 or 4 day window there where things really slow down. I look at that as early November. Look for that, because that period of time is also when the secondary rut takes place about 4 weeks later. And so when you see that on your cameras, you see things shutting down, really remember that date and then flip that ahead. So last year we got some really cool stuff on our video camera, on our camera, the trail cameras with video, where early December you see a doe flying by and then you have that buck grunting right on her tail. And a lot of times fawns are coming in at that time. But really it's a short, often missed window we'll talk about just in a little bit. Peak rut though, multiple stands is key. All day value is great. Get into the post rut. The post rut to me is for those long distance cruising giants that just don't want to give up. They know the game, they still want to play it, and they just don't want to let the rut go. So they start really looking long range. And that gets into almost gun season. And they're really, but if you get an 80-degree day, or you get a 70-degree day and windy, or you get some major weather, I think that shuts them down. You can really shut that period down. So, one year, the 14th, 15th of November is awesome. 17th, you're getting pictures of big bucks. There's lots of crews. I can think of some trail cam pictures in my head where monsters are coming through. And then all of a sudden, the next year, you get some big major weather shutdown on the 12th, 13th, 14th, and you just don't see those bucks after that. And it might be that your property's still great, it still has good habitat, nothing's wrong, you didn't do anything wrong. It's just that they stop cruising during that time, and then they don't start back up and down. It seems like it shuts down pretty hard at that time, and then it's going by the second bed. What I find in the post-rut, it seems like when you start getting into that mid-November time, deer are really starting to slow down. I mean, the bucks are wore down. They've really been pushing hard for a long time. I find a lot of times it's not to say that a morning hunt isn't valuable, but I place a huge priority on the evening times. I've had some outstanding evening hunts in that post-rut period where bucks are starting to want to recover. The cold weather pushes them on food plots. The does and fawns are hitting on food plots, and you're just following that doe fawn movement. A lot of times you go back into his bedding area in the morning, there's a chance that he's already there. Is he playing out on the fields? I mean, you really have to rely on your cameras, your intel, your scouting, your in-season scouting to tell you if that buck, you think he's in that bedding area and he's beat you there. Because this coming weekend and beyond, you start experiencing that roller coaster weather, there's a good chance that if it's 29 degrees in the morning, 27, then he's out making rubs and scrapes on the edge of the field. He's pushing does. He's really getting kind of amped up for the rut to start. He knows what's going on, especially the older ones. And that's why, to me, it explains why you have your friend over there seeing a huge amount of buck activity, and it's the pre-rut, and you're not. And he's saying, yeah, the rut started. I'm seeing scrapes, rubs, grunting, chasing, fighting. It's really, but it could be that you just don't have those mature bucks yet, and he has mature bucks. And so mature bucks, they've done studies where a year and a half old buck might make a handful of rubs, couple scrapes. You fast forward to a 5-6-year-old buck, he might make 50 scrapes and 200, 300 rubs just randomly. It's a lot more active. And so you're going to see a lot more sign, you're going to see a lot more movement on those pre-ruts. If he's there and you have a hog in the area, he's going to be aggressive, or he's at least going to be moving around and laying some scent down or some sign down. Post-rut, is he in bed yet? Is he not in bed yet? When you go in there, you're not sure. Really, I place a huge priority on that evening sit during the post-rut. And of course, secondary rut. To me, I hope I have my buck by then. I'd like to have my buck before November 1st because, again, there's a few that I have my eye on. And once you get into early November, all bets are off. Who knows where they're at. And so, then you start getting excited thinking, well, yeah, this buck came in last year and the year before, so now you have this one to maybe hunt in this stand. But it's a lot more of a wild card, like I said. Who knows what buck's going to come by. That's where, if you still have a tag, really pay attention to that early December. Try to fast forward 4 weeks from when you see that lockdown phase, when you see not a lot of activity on your scrapes and where everything's bunched together, we see a lot of does coming in, because that's going to be that central time of the does and heat, whether it's the 7th of November, the 10th, whatever it is. Fast forward that for about 4 weeks, and that's what will happen. To me, it's kind of random. You see some good morning. It's almost like they rest during gun season, they get holed up somewhere, and all of a sudden you get some, imagine the bucks. 2 or 3 weeks have gone by and they haven't had any doe scent in the air, or much. And all of a sudden, early December, there's a hot doe running around, there's scrapes opening up, the bucks and does are a lot more active, the does are getting skittish. And to me, that's a great window to look for and to hunt. And there's mid-value in the morning, mid-value during the day, but a real high value in the evening. Because again, they're trying to replenish energy loss and really trying to follow those does, follow those fawns, and hit those evening food sources. So an outstanding time to hunt. All this being said, I go to client properties, and there's at least a couple clients in here in the room, and design the properties, put the food source together, make sure there's enough depth to cover so you have room for does and bucks on your land, stand locations, access. We look at the whole thing, draw it up at the end of the night. Can do that, lay down a plan. You guys can lay down your own plan. I put out, I think on my site, I have 600 whitetail articles. I have 200 videos on YouTube. There's no secrets. When I find information, I have a potential blog and video list that Dylan's seen, and I bet you I have 200 to 300 ideas in here for stuff. I woke up early this morning, I think it was 5:20, and Diane's like, why do you have your phone on? And I'm like, I just thought of an idea. So I wrote it down in here for us to do a video this weekend. And I love this stuff. You know, really want to try to help people. I'm not trying to make this stuff up. You know, I live this. I scout whitetails, you know, all year long. I write about it. I try to make sense of it. It's something I've really immersed in. But what it comes down to is how you hunt your land is truly the lowest hole in the bucket. You could have an incredible habitat parcel, and it could be the worst land to hunt in because, you know, hunters are hunting sloppily. They're spooking deer. They're overhunting their food sources. They ruin the lines of movement. And in the neighbor's land with open, mature hardwoods that has no habitat improvements, no food plots, becomes a hotbed in the middle of November because all the deer know it's safe over there. And they go over and it's terrible. They haven't done anything. They might not even hunt or anything. Go around some of the neighborhood parks when you get in by the cities. Some of those parks are 15, 20 acres. And I think of a lot down in Oakland County, lower Michigan, where literally Kensington Park, I used to play softball, play a lot of ball up through when I was 25, baseball and then softball. And we're out practicing at Kensington across from Holden's Fields where we play tournaments. And there's a 10-point just feeding over there in the grass next to you. And on that 80 acres of park, no one's planting any food plots, water holes, mock scrapes, bedding areas, travel quarters. They haven't done anything. They haven't cut the timber. It's all mature. The point is it's an area where deer can go and they can call home and they're not pressured by hunters and killed and shot at and disturbed. They can just go live over there, their daily life. And so you try to put that and try to transfer that to your own small parcel. Hunting strategy and how you hunt is always the lowest hole in the bucket. And it always boils down to that. So we can talk about all this, but it comes down to making those high value decisions, playing poker in the deer woods. And you can often have a great hunt on public land more than you can even on private land. And let's look at it this way. The more attractive you make your private land and you don't manage that level of attraction and the risk that comes with it for hunting. Risk meaning that you invite all the deer in the neighborhood from a quarter to a half mile in every direction on your land and then you go in and spook them. Now you just educated all the deer within a quarter to a half mile of your land, but when you didn't have any improvements, and I've seen clients like this. So Minnesota, 25 years they had that property. First 15 years, several booners, huge bucks, 400 acres surrounded by public land. And then all of a sudden they start putting food plots in at year 15 and then year 25, they've had the worst hunting ever. And it's because they're driving the ATVs up to the side of the food plots, they're hunting on them, pushing the deer inviting, they're pushing them off to the neighborhood that has like 40 different landowners across the street on 800 acres. And the deer getting shot at young and they're not holding those bucks, they're not protecting them. And it really boiled back to, yeah, there's a lot of habitat improvements that can be made, they can define, but it really boiled down to just how they were hunting the land. So with that, I hope you've enjoyed the talk tonight. The rut is just starting. That's why we chose this time to do this.